So let's get right to it. Tucson property management security deposits are going to be handled just like they are in the rest of the state by the laws in the Arizona Residential Landlord and Tenant Act. If you want to get a copy of the act, go ahead and just type that in, Google it, and it'll pop up. You'll be able to download the PDF. I'm going to go ahead and walk you through every paragraph in the act. And I'm going to explain to you just kind of the practical applications, how the courts are interpreting these different paragraphs, and some of the different things that come into play as they relate to security deposits. So here we go. Here is the first paragraph. And for starters, I'm going to point you to the demand and receive words in the very first line. So security deposit cannot be more than 1.5 times a month's rent. So let's use an example of $1,000. Let's assume the rent was $1,000. So what this would say is $1,500 would be the maximum amount of the security deposit. So that is the maximum amount a landlord can ask for or demand. On the other hand, it also says receive, shall not receive more than 1.5 times. So where this comes into play is if a tenant offered more security deposit. So if the tenant said, hey, you know what, I'll give you $3,000 of security deposit, you cannot accept that. Now, this is something that is a common mistake, even amongst instructor on the field of property management and others, but that is indeed the case. In fact, several years ago, the Arizona Department of Real Estate even put that on their homepage of their website, that property managers and landlords cannot accept more than 1.5 times the amount of security deposit. The other thing that gets a little bit confusing is it goes on to talk about advance rent, prepaid rent. The way it's worded, it's kind of confusing. But the thing to understand with that is a tenant can offer additional money in prepaid rent. So this usually comes into play when an applicant otherwise might not be approved, but they say, hey, you know what, I will give you a full year of prepaid rent, and that gives you security as a landlord. Well, actually it doesn't, because by Arizona law, that tenant can come back a month later and say, give me all that prepaid rent back. And by law, you as a landlord have to give it back to them. So I would be wary of that. Personally, I would recommend you do not accept prepaid rent for that simple reason, because they could request it all back. So it's no security at all anyway. All right, paragraph B. So non-refundable fees or deposits, most attorneys and judges will agree that fees are by definition non-refundable versus deposits are refundable. So I would suggest to you that you clarify that in your lease. Make sure you delineate between those two things. The other thing to understand is that while security deposits are limited to 1.5 times the rent, fees are not limited at all. So in theory, using that same example of the $1,000 rental, the security deposit would be limited to $1,500. In theory, you could have $5,000 worth of fees. They are not limited. So that's something important to know as well, is those are totally separate. So C is one of the bigger paragraphs here, and the thing to notice with this is the move-in form. So although it says you have to have a move-in form, it doesn't specifically say what the move-in form needs to have on it or how detailed or how generic. So the important thing is just make sure you have one. The other part that trips people up a lot of times, in particular tenants, is that although as a landlord you're required to give the tenant notice of when the inspection will be, the tenant does not have the right to determine when it will be. So you as a landlord have to tell them when it will be, but they don't actually get the choice of when that will be. Now, my recommendation there is still try and, if possible, to accommodate them with those requests. But by law, actually, you are not required to do it at the time when the tenant would like to do it. All right, a few different things here. This is the biggest paragraph here for security deposits. And so the first thing is normal wear and tear. It speaks to that. Sounds simple enough, but the problem is define normal wear and tear. Well, the problem is nowhere in the act does it specifically define what that is. So that's going to be left up to the discretion, again, if you get in court, what that would be. But you want to make sure you're very careful in following this as closely as you can. Next is the security deposit must be returned within 14 days. And then it says excluding Saturdays, Sundays, or other legal holidays. We call these business days. So that's another thing. Sometimes tenants will get confused by, hey, wait a minute, it's been 14 calendar days and I haven't received my security deposit disposition yet. And so that's where that can come into play. You have to remind them, no, well, that doesn't include Saturdays, Sundays, or holidays. Also, sending it by first-class mail. You do not have to send it by certified mail, and in fact, I encourage you not to. That can create a whole nother set of problems. So sending it via regular mail and to the last known address. So sometimes you think, well, the tenant left, they never gave me a forwarding address, so I send it to the property that they were at. Yes, if that was the last known address. Sounds silly, but that is the law. And then last, there is language in there about the fact that the tenant cannot dispute the security deposit after 60 days. That was added just a few years ago, and it's actually a big win for landlords because the way it was set before, tenants, there was no limit. They could get them back years later. So that's really a win for landlords. So if somebody comes back 4 months later, this is what you can point them to and say, hey, it's finalized at this point, so we're going to move forward based on that. All right, this is one that is a very controversial, believe it or not, paragraph in the Act. So a lot of attorneys don't agree on how this is interpreted, and certainly the judges and attorneys don't agree, and even judges and judges don't agree. So let me explain to you what this says. We call this in our business treble damages. And so the idea is if the courts find an amount to be wrongfully withheld, they can reward the tenant with both the initial amount that was wrongfully withheld plus 2 times that. So that's where they get the treble, the 3 times that amount to the tenant. So here's what makes it controversial. So attorneys would say that if $200, so let's stick with our example of the $1,500 security deposit, if $200 of that was deemed to be wrongfully withheld, then this treble damages $600 and ultimately would be what would be awarded to the tenant in that case. But some of the judges have said, no, this says the full security amount times 3 is what would be rewarded to the tenant. So in this scenario, $1,500 times 3 is $4,500. So that $200 amount that was found to be wrongfully withheld could turn into a $4,500 loss by the landlord. So this is why it is critically important that when you're doing a security deposit disposition, you make sure you can fully justify any charges without question, because if they were ever to come in front of a judge, that $200, call it error if you will, could cost you $4,500. This section is pretty straightforward. Really, the legalese just saying that either party can still be awarded damages. Gee, this is kind of a weird one. I've talked to a couple attorneys about this, and I've been in the business for 16 years and never heard of any property manager or landlord using this clause. The attorneys, in fact, will recommend not using it just because of the Arizona Department of Real Estate's interpretation of tenant security deposits and those belonging to the tenant. So this is kind of a weird one. Never heard anybody using it. For all those reasons, I recommend you avoid it as well and just leave it be. What this paragraph addresses is if the property is sold, then the new landlord is going to be responsible for returning that security deposit in the event that it is tenant occupied while they bought the property. So Tucson property management, as it relates to security deposits, obviously the Arizona Landlord Tenant Act is going to impact us here in Tucson, just like everybody across the state. And there's a lot more to security deposits, both the legal side and there's an art to that as well. But hopefully this at least gives you a point of departure and some things to consider if you are doing a security deposit disposition. If you found this video helpful, subscribe below for more landlord tips like this.